So with the change in the House of Representatives, now committees will be decided by Democrats. The heads of them will be decided by Democrats. The delicate balance that's right around the center has shifted slightly, allowing for certain moments of intrigue, interest. One of them is that the House Financial Services Committee, which is one of the most powerful committees in all of Congress, it deals with Wall Street regulating, it deals with the insurance business, big money players. And today, I'm going to read to you a short piece that was written, I believe, yesterday. Yeah, yesterday. This was in the Post yesterday. By Renee Merle. The title of the piece is Maxine Waters takes the reins of a powerful House committee. Wall Street is nervous. For the past 2 years, Representative Maxine Waters has been best known for her role as a foe of President Trump, including calling for his impeachment. Now, the 80-year-old California Democrat is taking the reins of one of Congress's most powerful committees, and attention is turning to her skills as a lawmaker. Quote, "The most important thing is we'll be able to basically define who we are, what we care about, and the kinds of issues that we intend to be successful with or without this president, and perhaps with a new president in 2020, close quote, Waters said in a recent interview. Waters, who has served in the House since 1991, is the first African American and first woman to lead the House Financial Services Committee, giving her broad influence over the financial world, from Wall Street regulations to flood insurance. On Wednesday, she is expected to detail her plans for the committee. Among the likely top priorities, housing affordability and homelessness. She recently noted that the partial government shutdown had been particularly harmful to the poor who depend on the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Quote, "Millions of families that rely on HUD's rental assistance programs are dangerously close to losing their homes due to projected lapses in funding," close quote, Waters said in a statement. Wall Street is nervous. The banking industry has been benefiting from deregulation efforts under Trump-appointed regulators, which could slow under pressure from Waters. She could also use her position to turn up pressure on Wells Fargo, which has admitted to various consumer abuses during the past 2 years, and Equifax, which had a huge data breach that compromised sensitive data of 148 million people. Isaac Boltanski, a Washington policy analyst for the investment firm Compass Point Research and Trading, said, quote, "I don't want to be the next financial institution to mess up. We will have big bank CEOs raising their right hand a lot more," close quote. Waters could also continue to be a thorn in the side of the president, who has called her an, quote, "extremely low IQ person," close quote. That's what Trump said about the 80-year-old Maxine Waters, whom I've met and interviewed. And anybody who has met her could say that that's just patently absurd and demeaning of a thing to say about a public servant who's been in Congress for he called her an extraordinarily low IQ person, quote. If she launches an investigation into Deutsche Bank, which provided hundreds of millions of dollars in loans to Trump. Former U.S. Representative Barney Frank, who worked closely with Waters while he was chairman of the Financial Services Committee starting in 2007, said, quote, "She is very outspoken, but she is also a first-rate legislator. Waters didn't get much recognition for the work she did during the financial crisis, but she was essential," Frank said. Quote, "As an advocate, she is kind of sharp-edged, but that doesn't prevent her being a constructive legislator. She is able to do both," close quote. One of her chief challenges will be finding a way to work across the political aisle, With Republicans in control of the Senate, she is unlikely to move major legislation without finding a bipartisan appeal. Representative Patrick T. McHenry of North Carolina, the ranking Republican on the committee, has acknowledged they disagree on most issues, but said, quote, "There's also policy areas where we're going to be able to work together and get results," close quote. There are likely to be limited opportunities to find bipartisan solutions before the 2020 presidential election, said Ian Katz, an analyst at Capital Alpha Partners. Quote, "She has been around for a while. She has worked with Republicans. There's not going to be any big legislation that adds to regulation of banks. The Senate is not going to agree to that," close quote. One of the most pressing issues under leadership, Waters said in an interview, will be addressing the country's growing homelessness and housing affordability problems. Quote, "It is devastating. There are so many people who, for whatever reasons, don't have access to safe and secure houses," she said. Her perspective on the issue was formed in part by the global financial crisis. When she heard from hundreds of constituents struggling to save their homes from foreclosure, she said, quote, "As I traveled across the country, I saw communities that had been devastated because of the local foreclosures," close quote. Open quote, "I learned an awful lot about the banks, what the banks did, and how they did it. And this informs me about what needs to be done now," close quote. Waters introduced legislation in 2017 to spend $13.2 billion over 5 years on programs to end homelessness and legislation that would provide more resources to preserve public housing. 13.2 billion was that figure. She introduced legislation in 2017 to spend $13.2 billion over 5 years on programs to end homelessness, and legislation that would provide more resources to preserve public housing. Those are both likely to get more attention now that Waters is chair of the committee. Quote, "Homelessness is very real, and when you take places like Los Angeles, where you have such a high number of people living on the streets, living in tents or sleeping on cardboard on the sidewalks, it's not simply about Skid Row anymore. We're going to do everything that we can to have bipartisanship on some key issues, and I'm very hopeful that homelessness is to be one of those," close quote. A bill she introduced last year to restore fair housing protections rolled back under the Trump administration could put her on a collision course with Ben Carson, the director of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Carson has proposed raising the amount that low-income families are expected to pay for rent, tripling it for the poorest households, as well as making it easier to demand work requirements for those receiving federal housing subsidies. Waters again, quote, "Philosophically, he believes that if you are poor or if you are in need, it's your fault, and that is not necessarily the responsibility of government to help you reverse your condition and have a better quality of life," close quote, Maxine Waters said. Among the trickiest issues facing Waters may be weighing the fixtures. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Last paragraph of the piece. Among the trickiest issues facing Waters may be weighing the futures of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the mortgage giants seized by the government in 2008. A decade later, the companies are still under government control. There has been little urgency in Congress to tackle the complicated task of determining their futures. Quote, "What is a better mousetrap? It has not really been discovered, but I do think that we have to work on redefining Fannie and Freddie, because the basic mission is one that I agree with and I support," she said. This is by Renee Merle. She covers white-collar crime and Wall Street for the Washington Post. So, Maxine.